South Africa recently had some pretty deadly riots. What happened was that its former president was jailed, and he in fact finally decided, after ignoring a court order that he turned himself over to police, just when the police were going to arrest him, that he would turn himself over on the basis that he'd prevent bloodshed from his supporters who were camped outside his mansion complex known as Nkandla. Now, whether this was his motive or not is a different story, for the simple fact that what happened shortly afterwards, after he landed up in jail and began serving a term for essentially refusing to obey a court order to appear as a witness at an inquiry into state corruption. What happened then is that people started spreading messages which were quite terrifying and strange messages. I started receiving a lot of WhatsApp messages from friends who themselves had received messages of things such as voice notes where people were calling for violence and for the causing of trouble and causing the current presidency of Cyril Ramaphosa, calling that white monopoly capital, using terms such as B-word agent, which is really a Malema thing, and doing all sorts of other things to sort of try and stir people up. And there were messages, and there was talk about shutting down parts of the country and things like that in South Africa. Now, I don't live in South Africa, but I have many friends who do, and they were forwarding me these sort of things because I spent a lot of time living in South Africa, and it's a country which is very important to me in some ways, although it's not a country which is a country which I'm near to any longer, or a country which I feel I have any ability to change for better or worse. And so rioting began, and looting began, and places were looted and then burnt down, and after targeting things like shopping centres and roads and freight transport on major highways in the port in Durban, there was also quite an effort to go into suburbs and to loot houses. And this was dealt with by many communities as a threat. And you saw some terrifying images of crowds of people confronting other people and people with guns shooting and things like that. And I had friends in various areas who said there was constant shooting outside their houses, which they didn't credit to communities, they credited to something or other happening within the riots, and they feared it was rioters or something who had guns and were shooting. There was all sorts of strange stuff going on. I mean, there was talk of people trying to take over houses during the looting as an excuse for that. There was all kinds of stuff going on. And even today, if you look at the comments of major newspaper articles in South Africa, you have people who appear to be black, though who knows with the internet, because it could be anyone trying to stir up something, saying nasty things about coloured or white South Africans even after the end of the riots. But it wasn't really white South Africans who were the focus of the riots. And the people whose communities were largely attacked were coloured, which means people of black and white or Khoisan heritage, or Indian, which means people who came largely from what's now Pakistan during colonial times, were taken into South Africa to work at a time when the Zulu people were refusing and things like that. That's actually a large part of Gandhi's life story, involves that sort of situation, which created the large Indian population in South Africa who are South Africans. But they were in fact attacked, their communities, directly by many of the rioters, and there were videos of fights breaking out, of people being pushed in one direction or the other, and of the rioters doing what they were doing. And you also had many communities of all different colours creating sort of, or reinforcing neighborhood watches, which started patrolling the areas, very heavily armed, to try and prevent them from being burnt down or otherwise dealt with. In Chatsworth and a few other Indian type of areas, you saw rioters seemingly using petrol bombs and trying to loot places and then burn them down. Now, it might seem utterly terrifying and strange to see these images out of South Africa, like you see someone throwing a baby off of a burning building, which was a shopping centre which was being burnt down by the rioters, and people catching the baby, both mother and baby, apparently managed to get to safety and go unscathed. But those sort of images hit global news, and we notice globally, especially because of the scale of the riots. I know people personally in South Africa who had to go without being able to buy food for a few days, and in some cases had to go to a charity to try and get milk and bread, which was being distributed, because the supply lines went down. You couldn't get nappies necessarily, you couldn't get baby food necessarily, and things like that. So it created a rather scary situation. The question is, why did this rioting occur? And before the rioting actually happened, about a week or two ago, there was pretty hectic rioting in Swaziland, or Eswatini, depending what you call it, next to South Africa. The monarchists have adopted Eswatini, while the opposition seemed to be more attached to its old name of Swaziland. Now, what happened there was sort of mass rioting, and it was linked to the COVID economy, if you ask me, which is what I said. I said to friends in South Africa, okay, well, this rioting is going on in Eswatini, but it's probably going to be something which is going to happen in South Africa as well. You're probably also going to have some sort of insurrection or something like that. And I based it on my knowledge of the Gini coefficient, unemployment levels, and the sort of things which lead to revolutionary type situations, which is in South Africa, because of the lockdowns and because of the very poor economy and other things, the majority of the youth are hectically unemployed, and a lot of other people who used to be employed and in the middle classes have been pushed down into poverty. They can't pay their bills, they can't pay back their loans, they have been made poor, essentially. And in addition to that, most children are raised in single-parent households. There was a statistic that something like 60% of children born in South Africa were not having a father listed on the birth certificate. And that's quite a serious thing, because it's known the effects of single-parent households where you don't have two parents to take care of a child, because children often need two parents. They're very energetic and they are difficult to raise at the best of times, and you need both parents. And the statistics where there's only one parent often show that much higher levels of suicide, crime, failure to get an education, failure to get work, and all of those things emerge in the statistics. Then you have the bare branches situation, which is that in South Africa, marriage rates have collapsed, and men who marry and have children become stable parts of society. Men who are unable to do that and are unable to rise, which is where the Gini efficiency comes into effect, through the ranks of society to improve themselves, to improve their lot. If all of these factors are there, it creates an increasing incentive for people at the bottom to try and change their lot, to either try and break the system or overthrow it, or to try and abuse the system, as through crime or other means. And South Africa is incredibly unequal and likely to get even more unequal because of the effect of things such as Price's Law, whereby most of the people who can leave and who have an incentive to leave and who have good skills, which is their means of getting out, are leaving or will leave or have left. And that leaves South Africa with a loss of a lot of skills. But Price's Law says that 50% of productivity is created by the square root of people in the system, which means more problems for South Africa. And one of the major explanations for the fact that it became what's called the most unequal nation on earth in some of the statistics after the end of apartheid was that a lot of the most resourced people had left South Africa and continued to leave it, which created a sort of problem for those who remained as those resources were gone and were continuing to leave. And that was not necessarily beneficial for people who lived there. And any government efforts to try and combat that have been bandages, have not been the surgery which would have been needed to fix the economy necessarily. So South Africa is in quite a situation, and it continues to be in that situation. And even though the current rioting has ended after costing hundreds of lives and a whole lot of damage to infrastructure, to people's jobs and so forth, those root conditions remain within South Africa. And so do the sort of propagandistic elements of it, such as the things which were included in those voice notes, the things such as trying to push violence based on people's unchangeable attributes or their culture or things like that. And that's very much something which you see. You just have to look at the comments of most newspaper articles about anything controversial in South Africa, and you'll see that. And pandemics are known to increase people's authoritarian instincts, their instincts to reject the other, and their instincts to reject what is alien or different to them, which, again, is not good news in South Africa with its problems. And so the South African riots are not only something which is bad, and they are bad, but they're also something which are likely to herald a future which is less good. A lot of jobs were lost in those riots, a lot of critical infrastructure, and a lot of stores which won't be reopened were affected. Interestingly enough, the riots also coincided with the rebanning of alcohol and pushing South Africa back into a very high level of lockdown. Shortly before that happened, I saw friends sharing images on WhatsApp and things where they showed that there were waiters who had just found out from the television that their jobs would once again be taken away from them by this lockdown, which was being reintroduced. And they were in a tragic situation, and there was talk of waiters even going and begging people at tables to give them big tips so that they could maybe survive it. And the other side of it is that rioting like this is not entirely uncommon in South Africans, except in its degree this time. Because some time ago, I saw an AFP article a few years back saying there were like 300 riots a year in South Africa, or 500 riots a year, something like that. It's these hundreds of riots, and yet they don't hit media, they don't get noticed. And yet they're there. And these sort of rioting situations give rise often to things such as looting. And you often, almost yearly at one stage, would have xenophobic riots where the shops inside of townships, which were owned by people from the subcontinent or other parts of the subcontinent of India or Pakistan or Bangladesh or other sort of those sort of situations, had their stores burnt down and looted inside of the township areas. Township being a South African term for majority black areas created during the apartheid era within what was considered to be white areas for work and practical purposes. But within those areas and also within informal settlements, there would be these places being burnt down and looted. And it was a regular occurrence. And the tragedy of it, which was always noted, is that these stores were burnt down, and therefore the populations of those areas would have to go quite far to buy basic essentials because they had burnt down what we might call the village shop within the Western world. So that sort of situation emerged and continued moving forward. So South Africa's recent riots, which are absolutely terrible, are also something which are part of a pattern which has increased each time. And as you continue having even more inequality, more poverty, and worse relations within South Africa due to a political environment which has encouraged bad relations within the country, you could eventually emerge to a situation where things get even worse, whether or not it's as flashy and spectacular and shock and awe as rioting and burning down of buildings and children being thrown out of a building to safety and things like that, or whether it's just a continued quiet decline. South Africa's entered a bad cycle right now. Hopefully that's something which will change around. Hopefully that will improve and so forth. But in the meantime, it's important to understand this isn't an isolated event. And the type of rioting, while it was linked to President Jacob Zuma, if he had come out and said, "Don't riot for me," I'm not sure that the rioting would have stopped. It's something which has been building up. It's something which has continued building up. And it's something which is not pleasant to think about or talk about, but it is certainly something which is happening. And the underlying factors, things such as marriage rates, things such as lack of fatherlessness, essentially, things such as the poor state of the education system, which affects people's jobs prospects, things such as the poor economy, the very heavy lockdowns which people were placed under, and the inability to buy alcohol for people to forget the misery of their lives, all seem to have coincided to a degree within South Africa and created something which is awful and terrible in the form of the riots. But to see the riots as anything but a symptom of everything below it, of the terrible chaos, the terrible dragon of chaos which South Africa faces right now, is to ignore something which is even more terrible, which is the situation which has given rise to the riots and could give rise to more unrest or trouble in the future.